Well, when I was a kid, I thought I wanted to be an astronaut. The only problem is I'm scared of heights. And so that effectively ended that dream and I became a pastor. So there you go. Hey, we're in part 2 of Dream Job, and what I'd like to do, if it's okay, I'd like to take 3 minutes and tell you why we're investing 3 Sundays into a thing called a job, work, and career. One of the reasons is because of a question that you and I were asked when we were growing up, and that question was, hey, what do you want to be when you grow up? What do you think you want to do when you grow up? And I don't know how helpful that question was, but it did introduce this future reality, which did come true, that this thing called a job or work or career was going to have a significant impact on our lives. In fact, on average, most people are going to spend over 1/3 of their lives on the job, at work, in a career, which means we've been given this precious gift called life, and over 1/3 of it is going to be spent working. So if that were the only reason, that's a pretty good reason to spend 3 Sundays talking about that. But what we discovered last week is that the Gallup organization has taught us some startling information. They've asked for the last several years, how satisfied are we on the job? And what they've taught us is, or told us and shared with us, is that almost 80% of us are deeply dissatisfied with our work. So if you put those two together, what you have is most people are going to spend over 1/3 of their lives doing something that they're deeply dissatisfied with. And so the question we've been asking in this series is, are we okay with that? Are we okay with that? Or better yet, is our Heavenly Father okay with that? Not in a he's disappointed in us kind of a way, but he's disappointed for us. And so as a result, many people view work as a penalty box between weekends. They're ushered into the penalty box on Monday only to escape on Friday, but they're caught on Sunday evening and put back in the penalty box on Monday morning. And that's kind of our view of work. So the mantra for a generation now has been called TGIF. Thank God it's Friday. We've named a restaurant chain after it just to make sure we don't forget it. The theme song has been everybody's working for the weekend. And so what happens is, the result of this is that we have a gap, a gigantic gap between our day job and our dream job. And that's the problem we're trying to tackle in this series. And the goal is to try to shrink the gap as much as we can so that we can experience not the curse, not the penalty box, but as we saw last week, the blessing that God intended work to do and to be. Because as we saw last Sunday, work was not the idea of an economist, an entrepreneur, a business leader, a government leader. Work was actually God's idea. And he gave it to us as a blessing. And so what we're trying to do in this series is kind of rework and rebuild our perspective on work so that we can experience something far greater than what many people are experiencing now. And so last week, one of the ways we started this is to ask a question and lean into a frustration that many people have. And it sounds something like this. And I've heard this, I can't tell you how many times I've heard this. Jeff, when I'm driving away from my job, I'm glad I have a job, but I just wish at the end of the day I had a job with purpose. I wish I was making a purpose with my job. I wish I was having purpose and experiencing deep meaning in my job. And so what we looked at last week was what seemed to be a simple question. What is the purpose of work? But what we discovered last week is a lot of people don't know the purpose of work, and you'll never understand your purpose at work until you understand the purpose of work. And if you didn't hear last week's message, I would highly encourage you to do that, because what we did is we uncovered the purpose of work. And when we discovered the purpose of work according to God's perspective, what we realized is this powerful truth. There is no such thing as a job without purpose. It doesn't exist. From barista to bass player, from zookeeper to innkeeper, you can experience deep purpose when you view it from God's perspective. And that's what we did in week 1. Now today, we're gonna go after an equally perplexing and an equally frustrating question. And to do that, I wanna start with the high school students. In fact, can I see some hands? How many high school students do we have in the room? There we go. Can we just applaud for these high school students? I love it. Love it. High school students, I'm going to start with you today, and I want to tell you something that I experienced early on in my college experience that was alarming to me, put a lot of pressure on me, and I want you to avoid what I experienced. And so what I had early on in my college experience, I sat down with a college advisor, and she got a folder out, and she looked at me, and she asked me a question. And she said, she pulled her folder out, and she got a pen, and she needed to check a box, and she said, Mr. Henderson, what is your major going to be? What are you going to major in? Now, the funny thing for me is that she asked that question as if I actually knew the answer to it. I didn't have a clue. And so I started feeling this pressure and this anxiety that I'm supposed to know my major, and if I know my major, which means I'm supposed to know the next 65 years of my life. I'm supposed to know what I'm supposed to do for the rest of my life. And I felt like I was the only one on the planet who didn't have a clue. And I walked away from that meeting. I just made something up, by the way. I walked away from that meeting slightly depressed, but with this heavy load of a pressure on me. And then I started talking to some of my friends. And I was encouraged to discover that they were as clueless as I was. And then I began to hear that in college, most people change their major at least once, which means they were as clueless as I was as well. And so what happens is we put this pressure on high school students that you're supposed to know what you're supposed to do for the rest of your life. And the way it comes out, parents, let me push a little bit. The way it comes out is we put pressure on them saying, you've got to get into the right school. Because if you don't get into the right school, your future is lost. Let me tell you something. There are millions of people who've gotten into the right school, and at 33 years old, they still don't know what they're supposed to do with their lives. And so high school students, what I want to do is I want to release the pressure valve from you today and replace the question of what's your major going to be or what are you going to do for the rest of your life. I want to replace it with a principle that's going to be a lot more liberating, a lot more freeing, a lot more exciting, and a lot more helpful. So my goal for the high school students today is that you would walk away feeling like this. I'm not supposed to know what I'm supposed to do for the rest of my life, but I do know a way to find it, okay? And here's where we're gonna go today, all right? We're gonna go after a question. Last week we went, what is the purpose of work? Here's the question we're gonna go after today. How do I discover what I've been created to do? How do I discover what I'm supposed to do for the rest of my life? Put it in church language. How do I discover God's will for my career? How do I discover that, okay? Now, that perplexing question isn't only reserved for high school students. It's reserved for the rest of us in the room as well. And adults, if you don't figure out how to discover what you've been created to do, you forfeit something. And it's why so many people wake up in their late 20s and early 30s and feel very depressed and confused because they're confused about what they're supposed to do with their lives. And let me illustrate what they forfeit. And to do that, let me give you a quick story that happened to Wendy and me a few years ago. And it happened when we ran the Peachtree Road Race. Anybody run the Peachtree Road Race, by the way? Let me see your hands. Yeah, there's 7 of you. Good, that's awesome. How many of you apparently are still considering running the Peachtree Road Race someday? Yeah. How many of you think it's more patriotic to sleep in on the 4th of July? Can you see? Yeah, there we are. There's my people right there. There's my people. So I grew up in Atlanta. Wendy grew up in Atlanta. We had never run the Peachtree Road Race. So a few years ago, we decided let's run the Peachtree Road Race. So it was a great experience. And just as a point of confession, all right, I'm not really a runner. I'm more of a plotter, all right? And so I ran the Peachtree Road Race in 58 minutes, all right? So I know some of you are thinking, hello, tortoise. That was really slow, all right? But that was actually pretty good for me. So I ran it. Wendy walked the Peachtree Road Race with a friend of hers, all right? So part of the fun of the Peachtree Road Race, if you've ever run it, is that you get up the next morning and you get the AJC or you go to ajc.com because they list your name and the race time and where you slotted among the rest of the 55,000 runners. So I get up the next morning and I'm telling Wendy, hey, let's figure out, you know, where I slotted and where you slotted among the 55,000 runners. And, you know, I know 58 minutes isn't very fast, but maybe I'm, you know, in the top 10 probably. And so I poured myself a cup of coffee and Wendy goes, Jeff, come here. Like kind of a little bit of alarm. And I said, okay. And she said, I see your name here. And they have you running the Peachtree Road Race in 1 hour and 51 minutes. Have you ever felt like there's a group of people conspiring against you in the world? You know, they're like with their computers and they're just trying to, you know, make you have a bad life. And I'm like, here's more proof. Somebody out there is conspiring against me. And then she starts laughing. And because she went and looked at her number and she said, well, they have me running the Peachtree Road Race at 58 minutes. I said, you didn't run the Peachtree Road Race in 58 minutes. And then that's when it hit me. I knew what I had done. Like the night before, I had taken my number and my computer chip and put it on Wendy's shirt and shoes, unknowingly. And I had taken her race number and her computer chip and put it on my shirt and shoes. So what ended up happening is I ended up running her race and she ended up walking mine. Now, if you know my wife, Wendy, she's one of the funniest people I know. This was a gift from God to her right here, right? Because the next 3 weeks, she would see our friends, hey, what would you do for 4th of July? I'm just curious, what did you do? And oh, we did this, what did you do? Oh, I'm so glad you asked. Well, Jeff and I, we ran the Peachtree Road Race, and I don't know if you've heard, but I walked the Peachtree Road Race in 58 minutes. Jeff ran it in 1 hour and 51. Oh, no, you're making it up. No, I'm not making this up. Go to ajc.com/Peachtree Road Race, all right? Now, the reason I tell you that silly story is, believe it or not, that's where a lot of people are in their careers. They've never figured out what they're supposed to do, so what ends up happening is they end up running someone else's race. They end up running their father's race. They end up running their mother's race. They end up running their sister's race or friend's race. They've never understood what they are supposed to do, and they end up running someone else's race. So at age around 28, 29, 30, or maybe a little bit older, they wake up one day and they think, I don't even know if I like doing this. I feel like there's greater potential in me. And they don't know how to tap into that potential. And either they give up and the gap between their day job and their dream job grows and grows and grows, or they do something about it. And so what we're gonna talk about today is, what do you do? How can you do something about it so that you don't end up running someone else's race, but you end up running your own? Now, I'm not saying that you shouldn't run your father's race. My dad was a pastor, and here I am doing this. But what I am saying is, you need to discover what you've been created to do, because there is a race set out just for you. There's a race that's set out just for you. In fact, the Bible says, run with endurance the race that's set out for you. So your goal, your challenge is to figure out, what have I been created to do? Find that career path and start running. And students and adults, what we're gonna talk about is a much more helpful, exciting, and liberating pathway than what are you gonna major in. And so what we're gonna do, I'm gonna put a principle on the screen in just a second, just so you know, just to warn you a little bit. I'm gonna say this principle over and over and over again, because I don't want anyone thinking, what do we talk about today at Gwinnett Church? This is what we're gonna talk about. I'm gonna talk about why this is important. I'm gonna talk about how you can implement this, and here's why this is important. When we understand this, it's gonna put us on the pathway to discovering what we have been created to do, because you are a one-of-a-kind creation. And we need you engaged in what God has for you to do. So here's the principle. Put it up on the screen. We're gonna live in this for a few minutes today. God's thumbprints on you are clues about his plans for you. God's thumbprints on you are clues about his plans for you. How do I discover what I've been created to do? How do I discover God's will for my career? This is the pathway. God's thumbprints on you are clues about his plans for you. The greater clarity you have about how you've been created, the greater clarity you have about your God-given gifts, the greater clarity you're gonna have about your God-given race. The greater clarity you have about thumbprints, they're clues about his plans for you. Now, honestly, it's amazing to me. I've spoken to I don't know how many people about their career. And when I ask them, and they're experiencing frustration, there's this gap between their day job and their dream job. And I ask them this question, hey, what are your God-given gifts? What are your God-given thumbprints? And I can't tell you how many times people have looked at me and said, I don't know. I've never really thought about it that way. Well, if you don't know your God-given thumbprints, it's gonna be next to impossible to understand the pathway that God has set out for you. And guys, let me pick on you. There are guys that spend more time picking their fantasy football team than they ever have trying to figure out God's thumbprints on their life. I'm not against fantasy football. My son Cole and I play fantasy football. But at the end of the day, I'm not gonna be asked by God, why did you draft Matt Ryan over Tom Brady? That's never gonna happen. But there is a stewardship issue about this that we're gonna talk about in just a second, that it's critically important for you to understand this. But when you do, what happens is the gap between your day job and your dream job begins to shrink. Now, you know who doesn't get this? You know who doesn't get this? The people on the first 3 weeks of American Idol. You ever seen this before? They stand before the judges and they say, I'm the next American Idol. And they're like, wow, okay, let's do this thing. And they start singing, okay? And they start singing, first 3 weeks of American Idol. And if you were to dust for God's fingerprints on their vocal cords, there's not a trace anywhere. Not a trace of it, all right? And the judges are just dumbfounded. They're thinking, is this a joke? Is this a joke? And when they tell them, you're not even gonna pass to the next round, have you ever noticed this? they're completely surprised, right? And there's only two people on the planet that thinks that they can sing, them and their mother. Other than that, like the rest of us are going, you can't sing, darling. You can't sing. And so we've been sold a bill of goods in our culture, which says this: if you're really passionate, oh, I'm passionate. I love to sing every day. Hey, I'm all for passion. I'm all for being passionate, working hard. That's all great. That's great. You can have passion, but if you don't have a thumbprint on God, you are not going to win American Idol. It's never going to happen. And so you can be passionate all you want to, but if you don't understand God's thumbprints on you, you're not going to understand the pathway. But if you can combine passion with gifting, oh, it is an incredible clue, an extraordinary clue in understanding what it is that you're supposed to do with the rest of your life, all right? So here's what we're gonna do. We're gonna dive into this principle. God's thumbprints on you are clues about his plans for you. And where this comes from is from the Bible. This is a biblical principle. And one of the ways we're gonna look at this today is we're gonna eavesdrop into a conversation that an incredible mentor had with a young mentee of his, a mentor by the name of the Apostle Paul. And Paul sees some gifts and some thumbprints on this young leader, like God sees in you. And he says, hey, Timothy, he's writing this letter to, hey, Timothy, I see some thumbprints on you. Here's how you figure this out. Here's why this is important. And if you'll do this, you'll discover what you have been created to do. And so in 1 Timothy chapter 4, we eavesdrop into this priceless information. And this is what Paul not only said to Timothy, I believe he says it to you and to me. This is what he wrote to Timothy. He said, Timothy, do not neglect your gift, all right? Paul was a very passionate guy, and so I don't think he was like, hey, Timothy, if you think about it, don't neglect your gift. I don't think that was it. This is a very passionate plea. We're gonna see this play out in the rest of his letter. Do not neglect your gift. And the reason I believe Paul was really passionate about this is because this is a theme in the Bible. Paul wasn't the only one that talked about this. Jesus talked about this. In fact, Jesus tells this story one day called the parable of the talents. He said, hey, there's this owner and he gives different talents to these three guys and he goes away for a while. And then he comes back and he sits down with these employees, if you will. And he says, okay, I gave you some talents. I gave you some abilities. Tell me what you did with your talent. And Jesus is foreshadowing something that's gonna happen to all of us. And let me say it this way. There's some great news for you today. This is great news. You are a unique creation by the creator of the universe, which means that on the billions of people on the planet, you're not forgotten. God is so big, so large, so gigantic. He knows exactly who you are. He knows exactly where you are, and he knows his thumbprints because you are his idea. That's great news. You are a unique, God-given creation. God's thumbprints are on you. I got some challenging news for you. God's thumbprints are on you, and you're accountable. God's thumbprints are on you, and you're accountable. And someday, you're gonna give an account as to what you did with God's thumbprints. And when we say this, we go, you know what, God? I just never got around to figuring out what your thumbprints are on my life. You don't want to say that. You don't want to say, you know what, my sister, she was so amazing, so wonderful. Everybody loved her when I compared her to me. I just didn't really feel like I measured up. You don't want to say that because when you stand before God, he's not going to talk about the thumbprints on your sister. He's going to talk about the thumbprints on you because you have a unique race to run. My brother John's here. John is brilliant at numbers and math. I almost failed Algebra 1, okay, almost. And so I'm not gonna stand before God and God's gonna go, hey, let's talk about how brilliant John was in numbers. He's gonna say, hey, Jeff, let's talk about your thumbprints. So quit comparing ourselves to other people and start trying to figure out what those thumbprints are because it's a stewardship issue. God's thumbprints on you and you're accountable. And so Paul's like this mentor and he's saying, Timothy, do not neglect your gift. In fact, let me give you an example of what I think the passion in this verse is. One of my mentors is a guy by the name of John Woodall. John's an amazing guy. One time we were in a coffee shop over in Alpharetta and John was exhorting me and he's kind of getting in my face. I don't even remember what he was talking about, but he's kind of lifted out of the chair a little bit and he's pointing at me like this, he's in my face, Jeff, you can do this and all this kind of stuff. And true story, a guy from the other side of the coffee shop comes up to us and goes, fellas, everything okay? He thought that John was gonna take a swing at me or something, It's like, fellas, everything okay? And I said, yes, sir. he's just talking about Jesus. He's just talking about, that's what John does. He just gets really passionate, right? So Paul, I think to Timothy, is kind of like John was to me, going, don't neglect your gifts. Do not neglect your gifts. And then he says this, he says, which was given you through a prophetic message. Let me go back to 14 for a second. Which was given you through a prophetic message when the body of elders laid their hands on you. What does that mean? Here's what that means in our world. When somebody looks at you and says, you know what? I think I see a thumbprint on you. You know what? You're really good at that. You know, when our small group comes over and you cook this amazing meal and you create this wonderful environment and everybody opens up and there's great conversations. And when they leave and somebody says to you, you know what? I think you have the gift of hospitality. You're just absolutely phenomenal at this. Here's what happens oftentimes in church world. We don't want to appear arrogant. So when someone compliments us and says, you know what, I think I see a gift here. Here's what we do oftentimes. We go, oh, it's not that big of a deal. It's not that big. Oh no, you're wrong. It's not that big of a deal. And part of why we do that is we don't want to appear arrogant, which is a good thing. But please understand this. If someone sees a thumbprint on you and says, you know what, I think you're really good at that, we should not say, oh no, it's not that big of a deal. That's not humility. That's being a bad steward of your God-given gifts. And instead of saying, oh, I'm not good at that, maybe you just need to say, thank you. Thank you. Thank you for identifying a thumbprint. And then you need to start figuring out what it is that you need to do, in this case, with that thumbprint of the gift of hospitality. Because it's not about humility. It's about leaning into the truth that you are a God-given creation. And God's thumbprints on you are clues about his plans for you. And when somebody says you're good at that, maybe, just maybe, it's a thumbprint and you should pay attention. Paul keeps going. I love this. He says in verse 15, be diligent in these matters. Are you seeing the passion here? Don't neglect. Be diligent. Be diligent in these matters. Give yourself wholly to them. And then he introduces this 3-word phrase here that we're going to highlight. So that everyone. This is so important, okay? If you won't discover your God-given thumbprints for you, please, on behalf of the rest of us, please discover them for us. Because what we need is this world full of people who understand what they've been created to do, and they start running the God-given race that God has given them. And the more people that we have doing this, the more everyone's going to benefit. So that everyone. So if you won't do it for you, do it for the rest of us. This is bigger than just you. And he keeps going. Watch the theme, watch the passion here in verse 16. Watch your life and doctrine closely. Persevere in him. What's he saying? He's saying, watch for those thumbprints. Persevere in them, because if you do, you will save both yourself and your hearers, meaning that this is bigger than just you. The rest of the world, the rest of your world needs you leaning into your God-given thumbprints. And then Paul does something really cool, really interesting, fascinating, really. He writes Timothy a second letter. And it's as if he thought, you know what, I'm not sure I emphasized this point well enough. So he writes Timothy a second letter, 2 Timothy, and then the 6th sentence of the next letter, he brings this topic up again. And this is how he says it. He says, Timothy, stir up the gift of God, which is in you through the laying on of my hands. Stir it up. Another translation of this is fan the flames, all right? I love this translation, which basically means fan the flames of your thumbprints and your gifts so that the flames begin to grow, and they glorify your Father in heaven, and they illuminate the pathway that you're supposed to run. Stir up your gifts. Fan the flames of your gifts. And more often than not, when I talk to people who are stuck in their career, this is what they are not doing. Because when I ask them, what are your thumbprints? What are your gifts? Oftentimes, they've never done the due diligence that's required. And so here's Paul's advice. If we want to figure this out, just boil it down. It says this. Don't neglect your gifts. Be diligent with your gifts. Watch for your gifts. Persevere in your gifts. Stir them up. Fan the flames. Another way to say it is, don't neglect your thumbprints. Be diligent with God's thumbprints. Watch for God's thumbprints on your life. Persevere in those thumbprints. Stir up those thumbprints and fan the flames of your gifts. And if you do this, here's the promise. Here's the principle. You're going to have an answer to this question. It's the question we've been looking at today. It's the question that says this. How do we discover what we've been created to do? How do we discover God's will for my career path? And from the Apostle Paul, you do it in these two ways. Number one, know your gifts. Number two, leverage opportunities. Know your gifts, leverage opportunities to use your gifts. Know your gifts and leverage opportunities to use your gifts. Now, let me tell you why I'm so excited for many of reasons about what God's doing in our high school ministry here. Because right now, many of you have kids in Wombaland right now, and you have students in transit. And we have high school students who are serving in there right now. We had high school students serving at 915, serving in Upstreet and in transit. And we have adult leaders that are surrounding them and watching them. And here's what we're looking for, and here's what they're going to discover as high school students. As they serve, they are going to discover and begin to lean into their God-given thumbprints. And we have adult volunteers that are walking around going, you know what? I see a thumbprint on you. Amy, I see a thumbprint on you. Susan, I see a thumbprint on you. And that thumbprint for these high school students is absolutely phenomenal. But it's not just reserved for high school students. It's why for many of you, you need to serve, volunteer. If you don't want to volunteer here, volunteer somewhere else. But by volunteering, you're going to begin to discover some thumbprints in you, some thumbprints on you. And why is this important? Because God's thumbprints on you are clues about his plans for you. And if I were to see you in the community this week, and don't get nervous, I won't do this, but if I were to ask you, what are your strengths? Can you tell me your top 5 strengths? You should be able to tell me that. And if not, you've got some work to do. So how do you do this? How do you know your gifts and leverage opportunities? Let me give you 2 quick examples. Number one, I was challenged many years ago to email 7 people and ask them this question, and you can do this. This costs absolutely nothing. Hey, what do you think I'm good at? As you look at my life, what do you think my strengths are? What do you think I'm good at? What do you think my strengths are? And when I did this, I had 7 friends who gave me some information that was surprising. I didn't know I was good at that. They gave me some information that was surprising because I thought I was good at that. They said, no, you're not good at that at all. So you need to walk on. You need to walk on from that. Walk away. But it was confirming and affirming and a reality check, all right? Now, did it tell me what I was supposed to do for the rest of my life? No, but it was a clue. Because here were people in my life who were observing me, walking with me, doing life with me, and showing me some thumbprints. You should do this in your small group. If your small group has met for a season, for a good season, at least 5 months now, I would say, you have enough history now to figure out what the thumbprints are on the rest of your small group. One of the things you should do in the small group this week is just go around and tell one thumbprint that you see on your fellow small group leaders. You can, or small group members, you can do that.
So that's the first thing. It's to email a few people and say, hey, what is it that you see in me? That can be a humbling question, can't it? You just try that this week. I would encourage you. Second thing is this, and this gets a little bit more practical, a little bit more at home, is because there's several things that I've had the opportunity through different conversations of seeing things unveil, seeing thumbprints pop out, if you will. And so one of the resources that we have is, I believe this is such a critical step, such a critical piece, is we've created a website, a resource for you to be able to go and to find a little bit more into your thumbprints. In fact, this week, if you'll go to northtarrant.org/dream job extras, on that site, we've got several different opportunities and several different things for you. In fact, one of the first things that we have within that website is a spiritual gifts inventory. Now, that seems kind of weird, right? What is it? What do you mean a spiritual gifts inventory? Well, I firmly believe that within each one of you, that God has given certain gifts to you. They might be gifts that you have no clue about. They might be gifts that people have talked about. They've seen you and they said, hey, you know what? Have you ever thought about how hospitable you are? You are a great leader. You're bossy as a 3-year-old, 5-year-old, 7-year-old. You would make a great principal. I mean, there are certain things, certain thumbprints that we see in our lives. In fact, if you'll go to the website and you click on that assessment, in fact, it's a 10-minute video. It's a really cool, it's not like this, oh my goodness, I got to take this 45-minute test about me. I don't know. I mean, I like them both. Is there an option to do A and B? No, you just click on that. You click on the spiritual gifts handout. You print it out and you follow the video link. And it's a great, easy resource. You just pop. At the bottom, it'll say, okay, I had no clue. My gift is teaching. Watch out, Scott, here I come, right? Like that. that is a great opportunity for you to see what your gifts are. Another opportunity we have is my design. Now, when it comes to your design, it's an interesting conversation. And this is something that involves a little bit more work and a little bit more thought. I would encourage you this week as you process your design that you would begin to ask certain questions. I put DESIGN, but ultimately it comes from an acronym. What is your design? Design is, what is your drive? Have you ever thought about what it is that drives you? Have you ever thought about what is it that really gets you going, that gets you excited? Document it. Grab a journal this week. Grab a couple sheets of paper. Maybe grab your notes on your phone. I personally prefer journal and Sharpie pen. I don't do zebra pens. My brother does. He's in the Amazon. We'll keep zebra pens there. I love Sharpie pens because it's beautiful. But grab a pen, grab some paper, and ask the question, what is it that drives you? The E, design, is experiences. Begin to process, what are the experiences you've had in your life? What has happened to you? What is part of your story that maybe is a very good thing? What's part of your story that was pivotal? What's part of your story that shaped you and helped you become who you are today? S is spiritual growth. That's kind of a funny thing, but I would ask the question, what stirs your confidence in God? What is it that's happened in your life over the last couple years that has stirred your confidence in God, your ability to lean in and trust God with everything, to make business decisions, job decisions, relational decisions? The I, impact. What do you want to impact? Some of you, I love talking with teachers because there's this natural impact, right? I want to impact the next generation. I want to impact third graders. I don't want to touch an elementary kid. I want high school kids. You shouldn't touch elementary kids anyway. I want to impact high school kids. Just keeping it honest, all right? What's your genius? What do you do regularly, repeatedly, with great regularity, greatly? Repeatedly, successfully, and happily. By the way, this is on the link. You can get this. I was like, I've got this. Anyway, genius. And then nature. What is your nature? There's a PDF that you can download that's got all of these questions. It's on that site. I would love for you to really process this week. What is your God-given thumbprint? What is your design? And the last thing is, it's a fun little video, but it's your temperament. In fact, this summer, we're going to be launching a small group that's around the temperaments. And you know, you've got the melancholy, you've got the sanguine, you've got the choleric, and then you have yellow. The people, right? Never would have guessed. But you know that is part of your thumbprint. And learning about your temperament can really help challenge the way you lead, challenge the way you parent, challenge the way you relate to different people. One of the things I found as I took a temperament test is I'm a yellow-green. And some of you probably would have some of you are like, what in the world? But this idea of yellow is I'm a people person, and green is I somewhat introverted a little bit, but that was very low, okay, just to let you know. But you know what it told me as I began to process this temperament test is yellow controls through charm. Green controls through procrastination. And I started to look at my life and self-evaluate, and I'm like, oh no, that is me, right? Like I began asking my wife, hey, this isn't true, right? She's like, no, that's actually pretty true. You don't do something, and then you charm me at the last minute to remind me of why you procrastinated to the very last moment to do it. And I'm like, okay, well, that's just at home. Doyle, is this? And he's like, nope, Scott, that's pretty accurate. I'm like, So if you see me and you're like, Scott, are you procrastinating about anything? Don't let me charm you, right? But really, when you begin to take that temperament teaser, and that's just a teaser, it's just a little video. It's a kind of funny video, just gets you processing and thinking about it. But ultimately, it's something that was incredibly valuable because I began to look at my life and my relationships with other people, the people I'm leading. And I begin to say, okay, I see the flaw in me. I see the hurdle in me. When you ask me to do something and I don't get back to you right away, call me on it. And I've had people that have called me on it. Keeps you honest. But it's God's thumbprint on me. And it's not that I'm upset about it. It's not that I'm frustrated with it. but it's a beautiful thing of being able to realize who you are and how we can excel in the thumbprints that we have. So the link will be on our Facebook page. We'll have it. Just go to northtarrant.org and it'll be an easy click right at the top of the page. But I want to encourage you this week. Last week, we encouraged you to say, hey, Dream Job series, go take a picture. Remember, it's a who, not a what, but there is value in the what. This week, let's find our God-given thumbprint.